In 2009, Scotland released just 11 beavers into dying waters where they had been extinct for over 400 years. Scientists called it Britain's most ambitious ecological experiment. Farmers warned it would flood their fields. Fishing groups said it would destroy salmon runs. 15 years later, underground water is rising, flash floods have dropped dramatically, and species that had not been seen in decades are returning in droves. The results shocked everyone, including the scientists running the trial. Across the Scottish Highlands in the early 2000s, the evidence was impossible to ignore. Rivers, once edged by wetlands, had been straightened and drained for centuries, their banks stripped of trees and their beds scoured by fast, unbroken flow. Hydrological surveys from 2008 painted a stark picture. Peak floodwaters surged nearly twice as high as those in undisturbed streams, with flash floods striking every 2 to 3 years. Drought stress followed in summer, as groundwater tables fell 30 to 45 centimeters below historical levels, leaving riparian plants stunted and peat soils cracked. The consequences rippled through the living landscape. Water vole populations collapsed, with fewer than 5% of suitable riverbanks still occupied, driven out by habitat loss and unchecked mink. Salmon, once a symbol of these rivers, dwindled to less than 1 juvenile per square meter in the upper reaches, their spawning beds choked by silt and their fry exposed in shallow, sun-baked channels. NatureScott's baseline reports cataloged the decline with clinical precision. Each metric was a warning sign. Floods grew more severe, droughts more punishing, and the river's ability to support life steadily eroded. By the late 2000s, the prospect of recovery seemed remote. The Highlands waterways had become a case study in ecological unraveling, the result of 4 centuries without the species once called Scotland's original landscape architect. The need for intervention was no longer a matter of debate. It was a matter of survival for the river itself. 4 centuries ago, the Eurasian beaver was a common sight along Scotland's rivers. These animals shaped the waterways with their dams and lodges, slowing currents, spreading water into wetlands, and building habitats that supported a web of life. But by the early 1600s, relentless hunting for fur and castoreum, an oil prized in medicine and perfume, drove the beaver to extinction across Britain. The last reliable record of a Scottish beaver comes from a highland river just as the fur trade reached its peak. With their disappearance, the rivers lost more than a single species. They lost their original architects. Without beavers, the landscape changed. Dams vanished, streams straightened, and the natural sprawl of wetlands shrank as landowners drained the floodplains for timber and crops. The rivers became faster and more violent in winter, then shriveled to thin trickles during dry summers. Wetlands that once buffered floods and droughts gave way to bare, eroding banks. Underground water tables dropped, peat soils dried out, and the complex tapestry of ponds, pools, and marshes unraveled. The absence of beavers left a hole that no other animal could fill. Their engineering had created slow-flowing backwaters and tangled margins where young salmon and water voles found shelter. Without these structures, habitats grew simpler and harsher. Generations of plants and animals lost their strongholds, and the rivers grew less resilient with each passing decade. By the turn of the 21st century, the ecological memory of beavers lingered only in place, names and the old stories, but their role as builders of Scotland's waterways had been all but erased. The question now was whether restoring a lost engineer could help repair the damage left behind. The proposal to return beavers to Scotland's rivers did not pass quietly. At the first public consultations in Knapdale, the air was thick with skepticism. Farmers like John McPherson, whose family had grazed cattle along these watercourses for generations, warned of flooded fields and ruined hay crops. He projected annual losses of £12,000 if beaver ponds spread into his lowlands. Minutes from the 2008 stakeholder meetings capture the tension. Questions about who would pay for damaged fences, who would clear the trees brought down by beaver teeth, and who would answer if livestock drowned in a newly formed pond. Fisheries representatives joined the chorus of concern. The Scottish Rivers Trust and local angling clubs pressed the government for guarantees that salmon runs would not be blocked by dams. Dr. Ian Campbell, a fisheries consultant, presented models predicting a bottleneck for migrating salmon at every beaver structure. The Rural Affairs Committee demanded hard evidence that spawning beds would not be lost beneath silt or stranded behind impassable barriers. Regulators responded with caution. The government's 5-year trial license, issued in May 2008, set strict conditions, independent monitoring of hydrology, wildlife, and land use, with NatureScot tasked to report every measurable change. Any sign of escalating damage or blocked fish passage could trigger a halt to the experiment. The stakes were clear. For every voice calling for restoration, another warned of unforeseen costs and ecological risks. The Beavers' return would proceed only under the closest scrutiny, with every outcome logged and analyzed. The fate of the project depended not just on ecological theory, but on the ability to prove in real time that Scotland's rivers could accommodate their original architect once again. On the morning of May 29, 2009, a small convoy arrived at the edge of Knapdale Forest. Inside, 11 Eurasian beavers, 6 males and 5 females, waited in travel crates, each animal tagged and cleared after 6 months of quarantine in Norway. The Scottish Wildlife Trust's Alan Bantic stepped forward, voice steady but eyes shining, and declared, "We are giving Scotland back a native engineer." This was the first licensed mammal reintroduction in British history, and every detail was logged for the record. Dr. Simon Jones, the veterinary officer, checked the animals one last time for signs of stress or disease. Jeanette Hall, the NatureScot monitoring coordinator, clipped a GPS collar onto the largest male, then turned to her team as they set out acoustic loggers and pressure sensors along the loch's edge. The beavers slipped into the water with barely a ripple. Within hours, field diaries recorded the first signs of activity: chattering at dusk, branches dragged onto the bank, and fresh mud packed into the shore. Volunteers watched as the animals worked in tight family groups, wasting no time. By the next evening, 3 lodges had risen from the banks of Loch Quilbar, and a 12-meter dam already spanned a narrow channel. The monitoring team logged every movement and sound, their sensors capturing baseline water levels and the first shifts in flow. This was the moment the experiment became real. An ancient architect returned, a living hypothesis set in motion. Every action, every stick of wood would now feed into a rigorous data stream, building the foundation for what science would measure in the years ahead. Pressure transducers and loch level gauges quietly recorded the first signs of a hydrological shift. Within 5 years, the data told a story even skeptics could not ignore. Peak flood flows across the monitored catchments dropped by 18%, an effect typically seen only after major infrastructure projects. Water storage surged, with the volume held in ponds and wetlands rising by 39% compared to pre-beaver baselines. Groundwater tables, once stubbornly low, climbed an average of 27 centimeters, re-wetting peat soils that had been dry for generations. These numbers, drawn from NatureScot's Report 684, did not come from models or projections, but from continuous, minute-by-minute measurements in the field. The Beavers, working without blueprints or budgets, had achieved what decades of human engineering could not. They buffered floods, held back drought, and rebuilt the river's capacity to store life-giving water. The mechanism was now proven, not just theorized, a living demonstration of what nature's engineers can accomplish. Species after species began returning to the transformed waterways. Camera traps logged a 6-fold increase in otter sightings, up 600% from the first year of monitoring. Water voles, once nearly absent from the banks, now occupied 38% of available habitat, a recovery mapped in meticulous transect surveys. Dragonflies and damselflies flourished. with breeding sites expanding from just one before the trial to 9 by 2020. In 2013, the first great crested newt was recorded in a beaver-made pond, a milestone for amphibian conservation in Scotland. These gains were not anecdotal. They were captured in Nature Scott's report 685 and confirmed in peer-reviewed journals. As one monitoring scientist summarized, "We measured change at every level, and the data speak for themselves. Beavers rebuilt the living fabric of the river." Today, Scotland's rivers flow with more life, their flash floods tempered, and lost species returning, because just 11 beavers rewrote the future of an entire watershed. When evidence guides action, nature's architects can restore what seemed lost. The next transformation may be just one bold decision away.